rains fall on the red earth of East Africa each year, unfailing and regular. Pools gather into streams. Streams cascade down the mountains. The world's longest river is born. The ancient Nile begins. Since the pharaohs built the pyramids 5,000 years ago, perhaps no river has influenced the course of history for so long as Egypt's river, the Nile. The ancient Egyptians marveled at its unceasing flow and worshipped it as a god. But it was only 100 years ago that the source of the mighty Nile was discovered in Central Africa. From Lake Victoria, the river flows northward over rapids and falls until it encounters the first of a series of dams which provide hydroelectric power and regulate the flow of the river for 40 million people, people whose lives depend upon these waters. From Lake Victoria, the river flows north through Uganda, the Republic of Sudan, and Egypt, finally merging with the waters of the Mediterranean, draining 1/10 of the continent of Africa. What is it like, this 4,000-mile valley of the Nile? The story begins in Uganda. In the jungle and bush, the hills and green fields that make up this rich little country in the heart of Africa, home of the Baganda, Banyoro, and many other tribes who live mostly by raising cotton, coffee, and tea. For most of Uganda's people, life is still primitive. But in schools and universities, more and more are now learning the skills of the modern world, a world which for centuries they knew little of. The city of Kampala is the capital. From modern government buildings, the people of Uganda themselves now administer the affairs of their newly independent nation of 2 million, most of whom are Christians. From Uganda, the Nile continues on northward, entering the Republic of Sudan. The Sudan is about 1/4 of the size of the United States, but with a population of only 10 million people. Geographically, it is divided between the desert of the north and the savanna lands and swamps of the south. The swampland of the southern Sudan is the home of many kinds of African game. Though there are several different tribes in the south who live along the Nile, the Dinka are perhaps the most important. Most Dinka are herdsmen who live by raising cattle. As we determine wealth in dollars, the Dinka measure theirs in cows. Other Dinka live much of their lives in dugout canoes in the swamps by the river. Fishing is their main occupation. The fish are driven down narrow channels and speared. Though most Dinka still live as they have for centuries, great changes are coming also to the southern Sudan. Many Dinka children now attend school for the first time, where they learn to read and write, speak English, and prepare for a less primitive kind of life in the towns. Juba on the Nile is the main town and market center of the southern Sudan. At Juba, the Nile begins to have real importance as a waterway. Stern wheelers provide the principal means of transportation to areas further north. Not many miles from Juba, the stern wheelers encounter a huge area of swamp known as the Sud. For hundreds of square miles, an endless, melancholy sea of papyrus reeds stretches as far as the eye can see. The Sud is probably the largest and most impenetrable swamp in the world. The White Nile, as the river is called here, loses 50% of its water from evaporation beneath the burning tropical sun. When the Nile finally bursts through the Sud, it flows through the parched desert lands of the northern Sudan until it reaches Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, which lies about halfway between the source of the Nile and the sea. Though Khartoum's people come from a variety of Sudanese tribes, they speak Arabic as their common language and practice the Muslim religion. The Sudanese still remember the days when their country was ruled jointly by Britain and Egypt, when their presidential palace was occupied by a British governor-general. The continued friendship of the Sudan with the Western world has helped give this country security and stability unequaled among other new nations in Africa. Agriculture is the basis of the Sudanese economy, dependent almost completely on the Nile, because in much of the country there is almost no rainfall. Dams spanning the Nile hold back vast quantities of water, and from lakes created by these dams, irrigation canals lead off into a network of waterways stretching across millions of acres of fertile land. Cotton is the main crop. Sudanese cotton, among the finest in the world, is grown mostly on huge government-controlled plantations watered by the White Nile. Near Khartoum, the waters of the White Nile, weak and dissipated now by seepage and evaporation, are replenished by another great river which joins it, the Blue Nile, which, for a few months each year, comes down in a torrent from the mountains of Ethiopia, bringing with it 70% of all the water that flows north into the land of Egypt. 95% of Egypt is arid desert, the only habitable part being a narrow strip of fertile land along the banks of the Nile. It is on this strip, only a few miles wide, that Egypt's 24 million people fight out the daily battle for survival. The fertility of Egypt, a land with almost no rain, depends entirely on water drawn from the Nile by a variety of means. Farming is also the basis of Egypt's economy. As in the Sudan, cotton is the most important crop. Sugar is also grown. There are orchards of figs, grapes, peaches, and other fruits. Many farmers keep pigeons, both to eat and as a source of fertilizer. Kafrasita is typical of many Egyptian villages. The peasants live in flat-roofed houses built of mud and straw. Women and girls are seldom seen outside the house. Farm work is left entirely to the men and boys. A clover-like crop called bersim is grown for fodder. As there is little land for grazing along this narrow, densely populated strip, domestic animals are kept tethered near the house and their feed brought to them. Since ancient times, the task of raising water to irrigate their fields has preoccupied Egyptians, and today, irrigation is still the key to life. Dams like those in Uganda and the Sudan restrain the Nile from rushing to waste in the Mediterranean. In southern Egypt, work progresses on a vast new dam that will ultimately dwarf all others on the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. Built by Russian engineers and machinery and costing $1,200 million. The high dam will bring under cultivation 2 million acres of now useless land and provide new farms for 5 million peasants. Power from the high dam will meet the increasing demand for electricity among Egypt's expanding industries. Blast furnaces work night and day, pouring forth tons of molten steel, which symbolize Egypt's industrial revolution. Typical industries include chemical factories producing fertilizers for Egyptian farms. Textile mills annually turn out miles of cloth from homegrown cotton. Most industry is centered around Cairo on the Nile. Cairo, the largest city in Africa, the capital of Egypt, the undisputed heart of the Arab world. Long a British protectorate, Egypt gradually gained full independence. And today, people are preoccupied with the use of this new independence, the rising power of the Arab nations of Africa and the Middle East, the nationalist revolution sweeping Egypt. Beyond Cairo, the Nile fans out into a series of channels leading to the sea. This is the delta of the Nile, an extremely fertile region which feeds over half of all the people of Egypt. At last, the long journey to the sea is nearly over, as the river empties into the Mediterranean. 5,000 years ago, one of the first civilizations on Earth grew up along the banks of the Nile in Egypt. And for 5,000 years, the people of the Nile Valley have depended on this river for their very lives. Today, the river known to the pharaohs as the Lord of all rivers remains as it has for 50 centuries, the master of their destinies.